What is a human being? A kind of primate animal most closely related to some apes, but genetically so closely related to all living things that biologically it's really a matter of degree, rather than species difference between humans and other animals, and also plants. We have barely more genes than worms and apparently far fewer than tomatoes. Or tomatoes. Although obviously quantity does not matter, but the combination of them. Perhaps what most clearly distinguishes us from other animals is our capacity for self-reflection. We can remember more, systematize and reason, extrapolate from our observations, and we can, to a reasonable extent, imagine the future, including our own death. We have an extraordinary imagination, a capacity that the German romantic novelist even called the highest good. Something has happened during evolution that has changed us, separating us from animals socially and culturally, if not biologically. But what is it? And is it universally valid? Are all people everywhere and in all times the same? I don't think so. There are crucial culturally and religiously based differences between how we see ourselves and each other. Our Western idea of people as individuals with free will and responsibility for their actions is not a given, but has developed over a very long time and under very specific conditions. The foundations were laid in antiquity, as we talked about, in Greece and Rome, and in Judaism. But the step towards what would become Western man was taken by Christianity, and specifically by that religion's understanding of sin and forgiveness. Without individual sin, we would probably never have arrived at the idea of individual responsibility, which is a prerequisite for today's notion of citizenship, personal responsibility, and the right to one's own individual identity and all the rest. It is alien to quite a few people to think about how religion is a kind of fundamental cultural coding in us, even if we don't believe. I don't believe, for example. Sorry, Thomas. But over time, I have become increasingly aware of how crucial differences in the way people, societies, nature, and the universe are viewed are based on religious beliefs. These are pre-rational, although of course they can be systematic, but nevertheless provide the conditions for how we see things. Without basic assumptions, premises, it is not possible to think about the world at all. And many of our basic premises have evolved from religion, even if we have since left it and imagine ourselves to be purely rational beings. There was a fruitful debate a couple of years ago, well, 10, maybe 20 years ago, between Jürgen Habermas and the Pope, Josef Ratzinger, in Munich in 24, exactly 20 years ago, in which they discussed these things in a way that has stimulated further thinking about the rational and the pre-rational in both theology and philosophy, and society in general, of course. I think that uncovering these deep structures is one of the most important challenges for contemporary humanistic science, similar to mapping the human genome, but in some ways even more difficult, because we have to try to think outside our own systems of thought to understand how they work. And maybe that's not even possible. This is also increasingly important in a world that is in many ways globalized, where we have to communicate and collaborate with people from other areas, both around the world and at home. To understand how they think, it is important to understand how we ourselves think. So let's start with sin. This is not a simple concept. Different people in different positions have had different values throughout history. Quod licet Jovis, non licet bovis. The Indian caste system is an unfortunate still living example of this. One people can wash certain things, other people can't even watch them. For the Greeks, the concept of sin in our sense did not exist. You could break laws and gods, and do crimes against God's wills, and be punished for it, but there was no mercy in the later sense. The most famous Greek crime, of course, was hubris, presumption, arrogance, overconfidence, an idea that interestingly lives on all around the Mediterranean in the idea of the evil eye. But in ancient Greece, it was not the individual who was punished, it was the family, the city, or the country. A famous example is Oedipus, whose crime of killing his father and marrying his mother is unconscious, or he's not conscious about what he's doing. It is unintentional, but it causes a plague in Thebes, which is thought to be caused by the population by a miasma, an infectious force that must be expelled in order for the city to be cleansed and return to health. The punishment for individual misdeeds was collective, and there was no forgiveness for the offender, who had to be killed, expelled, or go into exile like Oedipus did. Moreover, there is no question of free will guiding the actions, but just as often it is the gods who, depending on their own conflicts, likes, tastes, and pure whims, inspire someone to commit a crime. The entire Iliad is a collection of accounts of how the gods give people different ideas and fixations that influence and drive the plot. In the case of Oedipus, he is punished by committing his crime as a punishment for the treachery of his father. So it's not really fair of the gods. His father Laius, which can refer either to his abduction and rape of another king's son, or to his having a child despite an oracle telling him not to. The god's hatred of the individual is thus often preceded in myth by a person being driven to commit a crime for which the whole society around him is punished, and so on. For the Romans, as for the Greeks, it was obvious that the majority of humanity had no free will and hence no right. Those who were slaves had, strictly speaking, no individuality at all and were hardly considered human beings. They were objects, tools for their owner's needs. A slave could be punished, it could be killed, it could be subjected to all sorts of injustices, as we see it. Persona, originally meaning mask, role, and caput, meaning head, used for example in the expression caput familias, head of the family, were terms used only for free adult men. Slaves legally had neither caput nor persona. To be fully counted as a person in Rome, one had to be both free and a citizen, which excluded women, children, and slaves. Even within Judaism, there was no notion of individual sin in our modern sense. Certainly humanity was punished for Adam and Eve's crime of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. We became self-conscious, lost our innocence, and thus became responsible for our own lives. But not in any individualistic sense. The whole of humanity was punished for the transgression of the first human beings. And here there is no thought of forgiveness, but the sin, the guilt, is a burden, often materialized in a kind of mark as on the forehead of Cain, which humanity had to bear, especially since the violation of God's law brought death into the world. Even in the Christian view, as we have talked about, human beings are born with a guilt, original sin, something we all carry with us. And if you put a psychological spin on it, perhaps it's basically the burden of knowledge and self-knowledge that characterizes human beings when we leave the home as children, as innocent children, when we learn to speak and so on. The Greeks had, as you probably know, an idea of an original golden era where everyone could communicate with everyone, and everyone was a vegetarian, by the way, and so on. And then language came and destroyed it. But with Christianity came a new idea of sin. Sin as something individual, which we can opt out of if we make an effort, helped by our faith in God the Father. What does this really mean? I believe that something very strange happens when forgiveness in the form of Jesus enters the world, and thus sin takes, or begins to take, its modern form as a debt that can be paid, a personal responsibility. For your crime to be atoned for, you have to admit it and ask for forgiveness. You have to repent and thereby take responsibility for your actions. You have to reflect on yourself, and you have to do the right thing. The sin of the individual no longer affects the whole of society and does not need to be expelled to purify it. No, now a system emerges in which it is possible to pay, both figuratively and literally, something that also gave us centuries of magnificent donations, wonderful church art, and, strictly speaking, the entire Renaissance, as the banking families compensated for their sinful taking of interest by sponsoring churches and individual artists. Even indulgences, as a kind of stock with a papal guarantee of forgiveness, evolved from this, but went so far in the late 15th century, early 16th, to provoke Luther and almost all of Northern Europe to become Protestant. I will mention again Augustine, that we mentioned before, Augustine's Confessions. It's really an amazing book. That is the first autobiography of a man becoming an individual. Not even Marcus Aurelius is on that level. I think it's absolutely extraordinary. From the Christian understanding of sin and forgiveness, then, the Western person is born and develops an individual with his or her own identity, free will, the ability to do both what is right and what is wrong, both to sin and to admit his or her guilt, and to ask for forgiveness and receive forgiveness, no less. Everyone shares in the divine spark, and everyone has the opportunity to be saved. Freedom of the will is central, especially to Catholic theology. Man must choose of his own accord. And the internalized responsibility of the individual is eventually emphasized even more in Protestant theology's emphasis on faith rather than action. We can discuss this further at dinner. Do you have to be a person to be a human being? Are all living people persons in our sense? And are there other ways of looking at people than as persons in the Western sense? Yes, I am convinced of that. Just as there have been other ways of perceiving people historically, there are also cultural differences today between different ways of seeing people as individuals with free will and personal responsibility, and as more or less subordinate to different types of circumstances. In an interesting study of how people are described in an Indian village, it was found that the residents' descriptions differed significantly from how Americans describe the people around them. Instead of attributes belonging to people as unique individuals, as is common in Western descriptions of people, they were consistently described contextually in terms of their relationships and actions. This may seem a subtle difference, but it is nonetheless significant. And it seemed to have nothing to do with educational attainment or the fact that the Indians were at an earlier stage of some supposed common development towards ever higher levels of civilization. Simply different. The Hindu notion of reincarnation with an internal soul and each bodily existence as temporary also connects people with animals in a physically tangible way. This cow could have been your grandmother. What has evolved is indeed difficult to dismantle, but because it is not something that is physically tangible, and I would like to emphasize, because we Westerners are losing the knowledge of our own deeper background in history, the history of ideas, and not least religion, there is no guarantee that our type of human being, the individual person, will continue to exist. Another area where the notion of personal guilt and the possibility of forgiveness is being challenged concerns what might be called the crimes of history. This is about wokeness, for example. Are all whites responsible for the slave trade that took place hundreds of years ago? Collective guilt. Are all whites responsible but no Arabs, even though they had even greater slave trade? And do the descendants of the black slave traders, these families that still are prominent in not least Western Africa, do they share a common responsibility for these things also? Individual sin, collective crimes, collective responsibility, these are all very complicated things. Has it to do with proportion, or is it a question of principle? Critical race theory and the kind of anti-racism that has emerged in recent decades in the United States, and which has become to influence us here as well, assumes skin color in a kind of hierarchy in which whites are always guilty, but in an almost pre-modern and even pre-Christian sense. We carry a collective historical burden, a guilt from which we cannot be freed, except through permanent penance and, in some cases, by simply paying the survivors of the victims. The notion of how structures and collective communities and dynamics absolve some from responsibility, as they are always primarily victims of circumstance, is linked to this notion of unforgivable collective guilt in others. What we need to consider more seriously is how this view of people affects or will affect our understanding of personal responsibility and individual rights in the future. To say that Western culture is fundamentally Christian is not necessarily to say anything about church buildings, theology, or the existence of God, but it is a statement of what it is that has made us the people we are so far. If we value this, we must make ourselves aware of it and try to understand what it means, at least.
Thank you. Stay on the stage. Do you agree that we are more aware that when we are sinning than we are aware that we lack in virtue? And if so, why?
If you are more aware
that we're sinning, when you sin, you know that you're doing it because you know it's forbidden.
I mean, probably, I think, because negative emotions are generally stronger than positive emotions for some strange psychological reason. So I think we're more aware of when we're doing bad, and that may be also, ironically, a reason why some people like to do bad things, because it's stimulating.
Thank you, Torbjörn.